Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Emily Slater, the Executive Director at the Bretton Woods Committee, and we're very fortunate today to be joined by former Treasury Secretary Jack Lew, who will help us kick off our newly formed legislative working group by discussing some of the international economic priorities for the new Biden administration and the 117th U.S. Congress. So before we get started, just a couple of notes on format. We will reserve some time for audience questions. So if you have a question, we ask that you please submit them by clicking on the Q&A icon in your Zoom toolbar. We'll collect these throughout the conversation. And then for the Q&A portion, we will unmute individuals so that you can pose your questions directly to the speakers. So please do send those in throughout. Secondly, this event serves as the official launch of our newly formed legislative working group. We'll share a little bit more about this working group later in the program, but this group will be responsible for leading the Bretton Woods Committee's engagement with U.S. policymakers. So now let me quickly introduce our speakers. First, our distinguished guest who really needs no introduction. Jack Lew served as the 76th Secretary of the U.S. Treasury in the Obama administration from 2013 to 2017. Prior to that, he was White House Chief of Staff, and he has held several senior positions in the U.S. government, including Director of the OMB under both Obama and Clinton administrations. He is currently a managing partner at Lindsay Goldberg. Secretary Lew, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so fortunate to have you and your expertise and also have your commitment to the Bretton Woods Committee. We very much appreciate you. And I'll quickly introduce our moderators before turning it over to them. We have with us today Whitney Debevoise and Meg Lundsager. Whitney and Meg are co-chairs of the new legislative working group, so they'll be leading this effort for us. Whitney is a senior partner at Arnold, Porter, Kay and Scholler and has extensive experience in major international financial transactions. From 2007 to 2010, Whitney served as the U.S. Executive Director at the World Bank. And Meg Lundsager is currently a Public Policy Fellow at the Wilson Center. Meg was the U.S. Executive Director at the IMF from 2007 to 2014 and has held several senior positions in the U.S. Treasury Department. So very grateful to all of you for joining us today. And Whitney, I'll turn it over to you to kick off our conversation with the Secretary.
Thank you very much, Emily. We are at the beginning of a new administration in the United States, and I think it's appropriate to ask you, Mr. Secretary, what you think the international economic priorities ought to be at this time as the world tries to recover from COVID and rebuild the global economy.
Well, first, thank you, Emily, Whitney, and Meg. I look forward to the conversation. The Bretton Woods Committee has played an important role for a long time in keeping focus on these issues. And I know when I was at Treasury and needed people outside of government who understood the importance of the international financial institutions, I wouldn't say Bretton Woods was alone, but it wasn't a crowded group of supporters of the international financial institutions. And it was always very helpful to me to have the support of folks involved in the Bretton Woods Committee. I think that President Biden is taking over at a uniquely challenging moment. And that means that Secretary Yellen, the entire international economic team are taking over at a particularly challenging moment. It comes after 4 years of U.S. either disengagement or behavior outside of the normal mode of responsible leadership that the world has come to expect over the last 75 years from the United States, regardless of party. And it comes at the end of an economic crisis and a health crisis, hopefully the end, which is a once in a century disruption to the patterns of economic life, work life, social life, family life. So we're at a moment of extraordinary uncertainty where economists and models don't necessarily have the ability to tell you exactly what to expect because we haven't gone through something like this in the history of modern models. I think that the first challenge is very basic. It's to get beyond the health crisis. And I think getting beyond the health crisis for the United States begins with vaccinating people in the United States. But it can't end there, because a transnational crisis like a global pandemic doesn't respect borders. And whether or not there will be further mutations that can't be managed with known vaccines and known treatments is going to depend on whether or not we're successful in extending vaccination beyond the United States. And we have a lot of work to do for the global community through COVAX and the other international projects like the World Health Organization to get that done. I think you've got to begin by understanding that as a challenge, unlike a normal economic challenge. I think combine that with coming out of a year when many economies were either wholly or largely shut down for a big part of the year, where the spread of the both health and economic impact has hit countries at different points in time. We're not done seeing the economic or health crisis in much of the emerging world. You look at Brazil. Brazil is overtaking the United. It's a developed country, obviously. It's not one of the subtropical, very poor countries, but it has a COVID crisis that's out of control and now the leading problem in the world. We don't have great data on many of the emerging and poor countries. What we do know is that they have health systems that are not terribly equipped to deal with the challenges, and the amount of vaccination in those countries is close to zero. The economic ramifications that are very real. We're going to see both loss of economic growth and inability to sustain debt in many, many countries. And how we as a world community deal with that is going to have a lot to do with the long-term economic health of not just the emerging economies, but the global economy. Let me just finish by saying what starts at home. The legislation that Congress passed yesterday is not just going to have an impact on the United States economy. The OECD is estimating it's going to increase global economic growth by over 1%. I don't think it's just a question of the United States. How China emerges, how the European Union emerges, how the UK emerges, how the large economies of the developed world emerge will have a lot to do with global growth and the capacity to deal with all of the challenges we have. I think we'll talk a bit about what the price of the response is in terms of cost and debt. But I think one of the challenges that the new team faces in the United States, but also around the world, is making sure that the response doesn't fall short of the need, so that we end up not having the recovery reach all of the parts of the world that it needs to reach.
Thank you, Secretary Lew. This really brings up the the relevant question for how the United States can work with the international institutions to do exactly what you've just been talking about, to help countries that are still severely impacted by the coronavirus, to help them get their economies on the path to recovery. While we're waiting for the boost in global growth, it's going to come from the US stimulus and hopefully recovery in other advanced economies around the world. So what do you think the US should be focusing on in terms of how it works with the international institutions to deal with all these challenges?
So I think that the health and the economic challenges have to be dealt with simultaneously. I wouldn't call them sequential challenges. And I think engaging through the global health organizations to make sure that vaccines are available more quickly, more broadly, is right at the top of the list. I'm heartened when I hear about the production numbers far exceeding the US population. because it's going to be a global supply question, and we're not the only supplier. I think part of it is not doing it alone. The last 4 years marked a deviation from the United States history since World War II of leading through engagement with allies, with international financial institutions, and even with competitors and adversaries to try to achieve common goals. I think that on the health and economic fronts, the US needs to be fully engaged. That doesn't mean that all of the organizations are perfect. It doesn't mean that they don't need reforms, but they're only going to be effective in meeting our national interests if we're deeply engaged. And they're only going to be there for us to turn to support our national objectives if we're a leader in the efforts. On the economic side, how we look at the debt burdens in some of the poorest countries is a very important issue. It's almost unavoidable that we're going to see debt crises coming out of this. You just can't shut down economies and expect the debt sustainable capacity to remain the same. There's been a lot of discussion in the Group of 30 report, in the IMF, about whether or not there should be special allocations of special drawing rights. And I think it's important that those issues be undertaken and that the US play a leadership role. Something that is different in this crisis than in past crises is that the United States is not the largest bilateral lender in a lot of these countries. China is the largest bilateral lender in a lot of these countries. And there's going to be a challenge both to the United States and the global institutions to make sure that China is part of the solution. And as someone who sat at negotiating tables with China for many years and urged them as they reached larger economic scale and greater global power, that they should subscribe to the Paris terms. And if they're not going to subscribe to Paris Club terms, they need to do something that is comparable so that we don't end up in a situation where the United States and global institutions are essentially making it possible for highly indebted countries to just pay back their loans to China. I'm hopeful that that's a conversation that will be more constructive than it's been in the past. All the arguments that I heard about China being a developing country and it not being appropriate to live by Paris Club standards if you're a developing country are kind of turned around when you have the Belt and Road Initiative and China as the major lender. The structure of China's lending is different than a lot of the bilateral lending from other countries. It looks more like commercial, than sovereign support. I think given the nature of state-owned financial institutions in China, the line is a thin one, and there is a pathway, but I think it's going to be important for the United States and the world community, not the United States being singular in its demand on China, but as part of an IMF discussion of what we as a group of nations need to do to have there be a discussion and a resolution of that issue. As someone who spent most of the years that I was in Treasury working with you, Meg, and others to get the IMF quota reforms of 2009 through Congress, I would just be very clear about the line between what can be done with current authorities and what would require new legislation. And I'm not saying that there should be no plans to ask for new actions by Congress, but I think that the fact that it took 5 years to go from the 2009 agreement for the United States to be the last country to ratify the IMF quota reforms came at a price in terms of the credibility of the United States and the reliability of the United States. After 4 years of tariff wars and can go to loan policies from the United States, while we're rebuilding US credibility as a partner, we have to be very mindful that we have historic challenges getting new commitments to international financial institutions through Congress. And I think Congress has to be brought on board in real time, not after any new commitments are made. And I think commitments have to be made with eyes wide open, because it would be quite undermining to US leadership and credibility if we were to have another instance where we couldn't deliver roughly on the same schedule of the other countries in the agreement.
No, I appreciate that emphasis, having been part of that effort to get different measures through Congress over the years. But just a quick follow-up in terms of how we could use some of the aspects of support for the IMF to do exactly what you've been talking about. And some of it might take a financial commitment from Congress. For instance, there's a window at the IMF that provides sort of debt relief to the countries, covers the interest and principal payments they have due coming to the IMF. Do you think it would be possible to get Congress to go along with something like that? It would take a donation to the IMF to cover that. There are other possibilities such as lending SDRs, but I'd be interested what you think the chances are in Congress for something like that.
So I guess I've looked at the things that don't require going to Congress at all first. And I don't know if the number is right, but it looks like, there's room for about $650 billion of SDR allocations. My understanding is that roughly 120 billion of that would go to emerging markets, and a smaller number, in the tens of billions, would go to the poorest countries. The challenge is, how do you increase the amount going to the poorest countries? And I would urge those who are more knowledgeable than I am about the technical details in the current authorities to really push to understand what the maximum you could do to increase the support for the poorest countries with current law. On the question you're asking, Meg, I think the case for congressional action would be very strong. So it's not that I disagree with the thrust of the question. I think it's unlikely that it would happen on its own in any short order. I can just tell you, finding a vehicle to do IMF quota reform took more of my time as Treasury Secretary than I want to admit. And the number of failed attempts, when you thought you got 60, 80, 90% of the way there, I can't count on one hand, and I'm not sure I can count on two. It was a huge challenge. So I would say that while Congress is dealing with the COVID emergency and the economic ramifications of it, anything that needs to be done ought to be done in that context. Because if it lags behind, it's not that there's opposition exactly, and sometimes is opposition. It was a challenge to convince some members of Congress that after the large amounts of lending into the European crisis, particularly with Greece, that it was something we should keep doing. So there are policy issues. I think the real problem is inertia. It's not at the top of anyone's list when it comes up on its own. And unless it's part of something that has the energy to make it through the whole process, I would think, if you were asking me in 2022, 23, would it be possible to get standalone action or even action in the context of something like an appropriations bill on a special provision for the IFEs? It would be hard. Now, I would say that the capital increases, for the World Bank were easier to get through Congress in the last few years than quota reform was. Part of it was the eye-popping number on quota reform. Even though the real cost was close to zero. It had a sticker price that was in the tens of billions of dollars. I think keeping it sized so that what you do is not shocking, and we're at a point where people are talking about trillions of dollars the way we used to talk about billions of dollars. So I don't know anymore what constitutes a shocking number. I mean, having something that's sized so that it feels like an appropriate number, and at a moment when it's not on its own, is the best way. And I think making the case early, having the different parts of the U.S. economic political landscape that benefit from both the economic aspects of supporting these kinds of efforts, but also the geopolitical benefits that come from it. Having that case made in real time, even ahead of time, is really important. Finding a hook to make the case on its own to Congress is challenging. COVID offers an opportunity to do that. So that, I would still put what you can do without legislation on the highest priority list. But I think educating Congress and getting Congress into a place where there's a meeting of the minds as to what the right role and size is important.
Thanks.
Thank you, Secretary Lew, and thank you for your comments about multilateralism in the context of vaccines. Clearly, COVAX is a very significant initiative, and it actually builds on a project that went through the World Bank Board when I was there, namely the Advanced Market Commitment for Pneumococcal Vaccines. And so this COVAX effort is really solving a lot of collective action issues very nicely. And in fact, the United States recent announcements about the contributions it's intending to make for COVAX, we're seeing a little bit of a repetition of the first decade of this century when we were in arrears on our IDA contributions, which were on the order of magnitude of $1 billion a year, but we were committing multiple billions to PEPFAR, and Congress was actually increasing the appropriation for that. So maybe we'll see something similar here. But let me ask you about another big collective action issue, which is climate, and see if you have any thoughts about the international financial architecture for climate. We have had the multilateral development banks involved in it. The MD at the fund talks about climate. We're seeing lots of central bank governors talking about climate. We're seeing the new administration talking about climate. We have a climate czar. The United Nations has the Paris Accord, and then the UN also has the Green Climate Fund and so forth. So what are your thoughts about the international financial architecture of climate?
Yeah, I think there's no question but that the international discussion on climate is in a different place now than it was 6 years ago when Mark Carney was trying to get the G20 and the FSB to deal with these questions as real economic and financial risks. The awareness of the immediacy of it is almost universal now. And I guess a few things. First of all, I don't think climate should be thought of as a sequential challenge to dealing with emerging from the COVID crisis and the kinds of debt restructuring issues that we're talking about. The conversation about climate, both in real time in terms of the ongoing rounds of post-Paris negotiations, but also in terms of domestic policy discussions in so many countries, including the United States, is happening simultaneously. I think when we talk about the challenges of dealing with climate, it falls into different baskets. If you're talking about the older developed economies and the emerging economies. It was a very big challenge coming out of Paris, going into the international track of Paris at Addis Ababa, where, not to put too fine a point on it, the emerging economy position was you, the developed world, use as much of the capacity to put carbon into the environment that you needed to get where you are. If you want us to live by the standards that it takes to meet the goals, you have to pay for it. And we came out of Addis Ababa with, I think, an important three-part strategy, which was it did require official development assistance. It required domestic support in each country of the world, and it required public-private cooperation to make it happen. It wasn't just a solution that was going to be developed economies paying all the bills. At a time when you're talking about extraordinary debt restructuring, admittedly, because of a global crisis that is not the responsibility of any of the poorest countries of the world, it's still the case that you can only have one conversation about how much support the international community can provide. And it can't be sequential that you deal with the COVID crisis and then you deal with climate. There has to be an overall understanding, going through the process, that these are two challenges that have to be undertaken at the same time. I actually think that, this is an area where, notwithstanding the tension between the United States and China, there's the ability for common interest to drive the discussion forward constructively. It made a big difference from Paris to Addis Ababa that China was coming in to Paris. India followed. Most of the poorest countries of the world understood that it was something that was a question of how do you manage, not do you manage. I don't have a numerical solution to what the balance should be, but I do know that you can't solve the climate problem if it's not taken seriously in both the old economies and the new economies. And there's going to have to be a complex series of steps taken to address the cost. And it can't be that the price for the emerging economies is you can't grow. That won't be acceptable in economic, human, or political terms. So it's going to be a big challenge. And I'd like to see things as opportunities. I think in a moment of generosity, when the United States and the international financial institutions and our allies, and hopefully China, are all saying, we're going to help you through the crisis created by COVID, that it can be hand in glove with a conversation of how we work together on dealing with climate.
Thank you very much. And I think the other area that we haven't really talked much about, which is not traditionally the main focus at Treasury, is trade. But there are linkages through exchange rate policy and things like that. What are your thoughts about how we move forward on the multilateral front in this area?
Yeah, we're not at the high point of public confidence in free trade and globalization. We look for issues that unite Republicans and Democrats in the United States. It's for those of us who still believe in free trade, not an encouraging picture. Let me go back to kind of basics. I think that I don't cast this as blame for others. We, all of us who care about global cooperation institutions and free markets, didn't do a great job telling the story for the 20 years, last 20 years. There was a kind of assumption that the benefits were well understood. And I'll tell you something that I learned in the course of both negotiating and working with Congress on the passage of Trade Promotion Authority, which was intended to make it possible to get approval of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The reason for that challenge is out in the broader economy, it's not obvious every day what the benefits are. When you go and you buy something at a big box store that you can afford, that you couldn't afford but for free trade, you don't say thank you to free trade. But when you see an empty factory where there was either because of political dysfunction or an inability to understand what needed to be done, not a meaningful government response to what do you do to help adjust when there are negative impacts from free trade, led to a sense that it doesn't matter if the whole pie is growing, if it's not being distributed in anything approaching an equitable way, if it's going to corporate profits, if it's going to investors, what does that mean for working people? I think that in order to kind of get back into a place where free trade has the kind of broad public support that you need to sustain it, we have to do a much better job making the connection to responsibilities for dealing with some of the kind of negative externalities of free trade. And
thank you very much. I think we're getting to the point where we need to open things up for the audience to ask their questions. So thank you for those thoughts on trade. Emily, I think you take over at this point.
Yeah, thank you so much, Whitney, and thank you, Secretary Lew. You've definitely given our legislative working group and the Bretton Woods Committee some good advice on how we should be thinking about engaging with Congress going forward. We have had several questions on climate, on vaccines, on the American Rescue Plan. I think you've addressed a lot of those. We had an interesting question that just came in on digital currencies. The question is kind of, is the US behind the curve on digital currencies? I'd also be interested to hear your thoughts on the US dollar as the global reserve currency as well, and how you view that at the moment.
I think digital currencies are a challenge because what they are is not clear. They're not really a sovereign currency. They're not backed by a sovereign. As a storage medium for asset values, as an individual, as an investor, I wouldn't have a lot of confidence in predicting what the next 5, 10, 20 years hold. As Treasury Secretary, we had to deal with the challenge of how do you address a technological development which may well have tremendous potential. And the whole idea of blockchain almost immediately had clear value without creating risks that you need to protect against. So what we focused on was how do you avoid having it become a source of illicit finance? How do you have know your customer rules apply? How do you have traceability if there are transactions that are suspicious? How do you deal with making sure it doesn't become the way that terrorist activities are financed? So we focused on those challenges and quite deliberately did not try to shut down something that was potentially going to have real value as a new technology. I think if you fast forward 5, 6 years, I don't know how different it is. I don't see digital currencies as an immediate challenge to sovereign currencies. I don't see them as an immediate financial stability risk. If you started seeing the concentration of holdings of digital currencies in systemically significant institutions, I would worry about it in a different way. It may be a good or a bad idea in terms of investors storing their wealth. To me, it's a gamble. I'm not a gambler, so I don't invest in digital currencies. Where I think the future issues lie is in the potential evolution of a market basket of sovereign currencies that is a digital currency. Because then you've crossed from the space of being an asset of speculative value to an asset that is backed by a group of sovereigns. It hasn't happened yet in a way that is big. SDR started out its life in Keynes's mind as Bancor. It was going to be an alternative means of having a global reserve currency. There is the possibility that a digital currency that was rooted in sovereign currencies could gain traction in that space. I don't see it as an immediate issue, but I do think that when you think about the kind of primacy of the dollar over the next 25 or 50 years, people should be asking the question. When I look at the dollar as a world reserve currency, I have spoken a fair amount, both in public life and since, about what the challenges are. I think the fact that there is no other currency in the world that's a significant challenger still gives us a long runway before we have to worry about it as an immediate problem. But I do think it is incumbent on us not to take it for granted. And in the way we pursue economic statecraft, how we use the authority that the power we have with the dollar in sanctions, it can't be perceived as arbitrary, and it can't be perceived as against the common understandings of all of our allies over and over and over again. We have to reserve the moments when we stand out alone for matters of the utmost importance, and it can't become a daily or weekly or monthly occurrence, things like secondary sanctions. And that doesn't mean we forego the right to do what we need to do. I think the combination of technology that theoretically gives you the ability to work around the United States, and candidly, 4 years of the United States acting uncharacteristically on a go-it-alone basis, both in trade and sanctions, has caused the world to be a little on its heels and on edge. And I think the new administration's got to figure out how to be tough on the things that are in our interest, and consulting, bringing other countries along where we can, and understanding that even if you take what's a 25 or 50-year challenge, taking 10 years off of that is a big deal in terms of our economic and geopolitical strength. And as the last thing I would say is, I don't think there were a lot of people predicting that sterling was going to slip out of its place as the world's reserve currency. When it happens quickly. So it may not be on the horizon, but it's not necessarily the case that you see it, with clarity way in advance.
Thank you, Secretary Lew. Picking up on a couple of those points about U.S. leadership and cooperation with other countries, we've had a few questions about the G7 and the G20 and the effectiveness of those platforms for cooperation. You've suggested the last 4 years have been an anomaly in terms of U.S. engagement there. How do you view those going forward, and how can they be made more effective?
It's hard. First of all, you lock in a constellation at a moment in time, and then things change. So you look at the G20. It's probably not the same 20 countries you would put it if you were forming a G20 today. It's not mostly going to change, but there's very little room in these systems to adapt to countries that are growing, countries that are shrinking, where their kind of place in the world order isn't 20 years later what it was 20 years ago. They don't have the capacity to make policy on a global basis. And I think it's a mistake to think of like the G20 or the G7 as a legislative body. I think we did learn coming out of the financial crisis and in the unified response for a number of years after that, that it is a very useful forum to drive emergency action across countries with, either overlapping or shared interests. Something that Alan Greenspan said to me when I was asking him, why do you travel so much to go to these meetings where at each meeting you do so little? And he said to me, it's not about the meetings, it's about the moments of crisis when you need to work with each other and how well you know each other. And I actually found that to be the case on many occasions. There were counterparts at central banks or finance ministries or as heads of state that you just wouldn't have known the same way if you didn't engage in the G20. Now, I don't think it's just a social activity. I think you look at questions like trade or tax reform and whether or not there's a race to the bottom to create tax havens, or how exchange rates should be managed to be fair and not to gain undue advantage, to the question of how do you deal with emerging from a global pandemic and economic crisis. If there can be common understandings coming out of that, it helps to drive policy in each country. And then there are the international financial institutions where we come together and act collectively, which dovetail with, you can't drive the IMF from the G20, as the non-G20 countries will tell you if you try. But it's also not the case that the IMF is unaware of where the G20 is. It's an iterative process. So I think they're very valuable undertakings. I think it's a mistake to expect too much from them in terms of specific commitments at a moment that isn't a moment of crisis. In a moment of crisis, and you can define crisis in different ways. Crisis can be the financial crisis of 08-09. It can be the current COVID crisis, or it could be the challenge of dealing with climate change. Crises come in different forms, but without there being something that's perceived as urgent on a pretty much universal level, it's very hard to get the bodies to drive things in the concrete way that they're looked to drive policy.
And you've mentioned China a couple of times, and I think the G20 is a good example of trying to engage China, especially as it relates to sovereign debt and the DSSI initiative and the common framework. So perhaps an example of a good opportunity for engagement there, although there are challenges with the implementation of those.
Yeah, no, there's certainly been progress, but I don't think, if you compare where we are now to where you would be if China was part of the Paris Club, there's still a long way to go. And the question is, how do you get to a place that is appropriate for where China is? And I mean appropriate in both ways, both in terms of its size and its significant, economic power, but also in terms of the underlying questions about the levels of individual income and poverty that remain in China. So I really do try to be an optimist, even with all of the issues of tension between the United States and China. I think, if it was Yi Gang's initiative to write in the Financial Times about the SDRs, it is a natural conversation to tie to that. how do we work together as global global institution to make sure that it treats all of us fairly. And I hope that's where the conversation goes.
And hopefully the common framework is a step toward what you're asking for, because in essence, what it does is it brings the Paris Club process closer to the private sector process. It's an opportunity to, if we can engage China in the Paris Club, to also get them in on the private side and bridge that gap.
Yeah, I mean, what's challenging is that the lending of the Chinese commercial banks looks so much more like sovereign lending that we do through governmental bodies. And the fact that state-owned enterprises operate in a commercial frame just creates an ambiguity of what they are. But I agree, having the two processes come closer narrows that gap.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up, because the Bretton Woods Committee will be launching a new special project on sovereign debt, where we will be tackling some of the debt transparency issues, private sector participation, and we'll be sharing more about that at our annual meeting in April. So this is a nice lead into that. One final question for you, Secretary Lew. We've had a couple of questions come in about quota reform and the upcoming quota review, IMF quota review. And any quota review process, will assess countries' voting power and quota shares. China will be at the center of that conversation. Any insights from your past experience here, or suggestions on how we can think about this going forward, how the U.S. can approach it, and how the Bretton Woods Committee can help?
Yeah, that's it. It's a hard question. I always believed, and I still do, that the IMF is stronger if the allocation of both, quota and responsibility reflects the way the global economy is evolving. It can't become an institution that's stuck in time. I also believe it's important that the United States retain its very significant influence at the IMF, which we're not even close to losing. Where the marginal shifts are, if you look at quota reform the last time around, it was mostly Europe giving up quota to other countries. It didn't mostly come out of the United States. I haven't done the calculations what it would look like if you were doing that again. When the question came up while I was at Treasury, whether the RMB should be included in the special drawing rights basket, we cooperated with the IMF and with China when they met certain hurdles. It wasn't something that immediately made the RMB a global reserve currency, but it was further along the lines of pressing for transparency and recognition. I think it was the right thing to do. I don't think the right approach for the United States is to try to keep China out of positions of shared responsibility in institutions like the IMF. I actually think we're better off if, when we are in a body that we have a very significant voice in, and China ends up subscribing to the policy, that leads to the greatest likelihood, not that they're going to become a mini US economy or a mini US democracy, but they'll live by the rules that they've been part of modifying over time. I still think that is the case. Now, the ultimate share reallocations tend to be fairly small, but very important to each of the countries involved. I'm not up to date on what the movements would be if there was a new quota increase. And I suspect that post-COVID, it's going to be also influenced by how strong the recovery is in each of the different countries and categories of countries. So it's very much connected to whether or not there's a broadly shared health and economic recovery, what the snapshot of global GDP would look like. it's moving away from the IMF. We faced a challenge at the Inter-American Development Bank when there was a desire for a new public-private partnership initiative as a side pocket to the MAID fund. We had an overwhelming ability to maintain our veto power in the main fund. But at a time when we were dealing with the very substantial challenge of getting Congress to ratify the IMF quota reforms, we didn't think it was prudent to make a new commitment that would require congressional ratification. We ended up negotiating a reallocation from the main fund to the side pocket fund so that the United States would maintain its influence in the main fund and be a partner in the new fund. And if you looked at the United States in combination with mostly like-minded allies, we had a strong voice in the side pocket fund. I think you have to be creative when you think about how do you deal with new commitments. The history over the last 75 years is that the United States has led substantially, both in terms of its financial commitments and the voting power and authority that comes with that. I don't think it would be right, as there are marginal shifts for that history of 75 years, to change on a dime. And figuring out how to navigate through the transition at a time of, frankly, increasing levels of conflict between the United States and China makes it very hard. I will say that when we were seeking the patience of the IMF not to pursue paths to try and resolve the quota issue without the United States, all of which we ultimately could have had some ability to veto, but it would have been a real damage to the institution and our role in it. China was one of the countries that said, we trust the United States to get this done. So, we can work together in these institutions. And, I was grateful for that support. Meg had to be living through it day in and day out. I'm not exaggerating, I don't think. That's not to say that they didn't think that they deserve a larger quota. They do think they deserve a larger quota. So I don't have numerical answers, but that's kind of how I think about it conceptually.
Yeah, it's a tough question, like you said. Meg and Whitney, before we tell the audience a little bit more and our members a little more about the Legislative Working Group, just want to give you a final opportunity to ask the Secretary any final questions or share any final thoughts. Meg?
Well, I still have a lot of questions, but I think I'll save them. I'm really focused on the transparency side of all we're trying to do. And I think to get success in the different areas the Secretary's been talking about, we need a lot more transparency in transactions, whether it's applying to SDRs or applying to debt, and transparency on the part of the lenders and the creditors, the lenders and the debtors as well, which has been a challenge. So I think these are things we'd look forward to talking about another time, but I won't ask a specific question at this point.
I'm in somewhat the same circumstance. I think I'm left with a lingering question about whether we have a kind of generic change in our approach to macro policy, particularly fiscal policy. We've just seen a large stimulus bill in the United States, and the IMF seems to be telling countries to take care of COVID and worry about the finances later. But does that represent a kind of paradigmatic shift in our approach to spending and deficits and debt and so forth? But we'll have to leave that for another day, and that's our
that deserves its own
we can
hour.
invite you back again.
That's right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Secretary Lew. We've covered a lot of ground today, and I think you've given us some good advice for how to think about engaging on some of these issues going forward. And I want to turn it back to Whitney and Meg to talk a little bit about our Legislative Working Group and some of our priorities for this working group. Just quickly before I do, a little bit of background on the Bretton Woods Committee working groups. In December, our new board of directors adopted a new program model that is centered on working groups. So we will be rolling out several of these over the course of the next couple of years. Some of them are designed as special projects. I mentioned the sovereign debt project that is being led by Bill Rhodes and John Lipsky, which we will be sharing more about in the coming months. And then others are designed as kind of standing working groups that will lead BWC's annual programming on our core issues. So today is the official launch of one of these standing working groups, our legislative working group. And I'll turn it over to Whitney to share a little bit more about the roadmap ahead.
Thank you, Emily. Well, we're very fortunate to have recruited an excellent working group. Sarah Aviel, Tony Fratto, Bill Frymoyer, Clay Lowry, Scott Morris, and former Congressman Jim Colby. I think we are looking forward to our traditional types of engagement when there are actual action items like appropriations bills. But as I mentioned earlier, we also want to undertake an education effort so that as the Secretary is pointing out with the G20, the value is in times of crisis, namely in times when things have to be passed. You have a level of trust, and the Bretton Woods Committee can be seen as a reliable interlocutor and really a fact-based organization and a provider of reliable facts about the issues that are coming along. So we really look forward to pursuing both dimensions of that effort, and that's what the working group will be about.
Yeah, just to emphasize, I think it'd be really helpful if we can be a resource, especially to people on the Hill where they have so many issues in front of them. Things are changing so quickly. It's very difficult to keep the details of some of these arcane IMF, World Bank, other institutions, budgetary issues, policy straight. And so I think if we can be this constant availability and pull many of our members in the committee, in the Bretton Woods Committee, into helping us do briefings, be available to answer questions, I think will be very important.
Yes, we definitely will try to do that. And you know, some of these things even get down into the arcane aspects of OMB scoring, as I'm sure this knows. So we really look forward to all the technical assistance we can get and that we can provide to the Congress.
And CBO scoring, as we learned.
Yes.
Yes, it's very difficult to fathom at times.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Whitney and Meg. We're looking forward to your leadership for this new working group. And thank you so much, Secretary Lew, for joining us today and helping us launch this effort. We're looking forward to deepening our engagement and our impact in this space. So just quickly before signing off, I just want to remind our members that if you haven't registered for our upcoming annual meeting the week of April 5th, please do so. We'll be announcing additional sessions and speakers soon. So check out our website and stay tuned for invitations in your email inbox. So I think that'll be a wrap for today. Thank you all once again, and hope to see you all at the annual meeting.
Thanks so much.
And thank you.
Thank you.